Hello, this is Chris McGilligott-Park. I am back with video 2 in this series. Instead of giving you timestamps, this one's going to be a little more practical. The first one was more about the overall architecture and design thought process. You know, when it comes to the overall thought process, I think it's worth understanding that because it informs the sort of decisions you're going to make. But now let's talk about concrete things. I said at the end of the last video, we've got 3 different types of classes of data, essentially. We've got faction, world, and unit data, or squad data. And then there's a base and a deep info possible for each. World is not required. World has a many-to-many relationship. Well, actually a one-to-many relationship. So there's only one world, period. And one world can have any number of world singletons on it. So I'll show you one in a while, but you can have like AI world data, and there's a bunch of different ones that you can have. So, but each one you can only have one of. So when I say a singleton, I mean that literally with that. With faction data, they must have a base and a deep info, and they have a one-to-one relationship. So for every faction, if you've got a Devour a Golem faction, then that has a deep info and a base info. Some factions only let you have a single instance of that faction. For those factions, I, as a convention, have taken to putting a flag on them that makes that clear. I put this singleton, this interface on there that says ExternalBaseInfo _ singleton. There is a deep info equivalent. This doesn't actually do anything, but it helps with readability. If you're programming to it, and this is a faction that is only ever one, the only other way you would know that there's only ever one of this faction would be to go and check the XML. That's annoying. So I would ask that you please put the singleton thing on there if you're, even if this code that you're writing is just for you, it's just good form, you know? You want to make it so that if you don't remember things very well and you come back to it years later, that you can understand it. Or if you retire from modding on this game and you want to pass it on to somebody else, that they have an easier time of it. You would be shocked to know how much you will forget over the span of a decade. Because, I mean, you know, the Valor Without Wind, people will ask me questions sometimes about features I designed, and it's like they're talking about a game I've never played. I mean, I spent a lot of intensive time, like a year. It was my full-time job for like a year and a half, something like that, working on a Valor Without Wind 1 and 2. And I don't remember at all. I took that out of my brain. It's just not something I needed. So do your future self a favor, organize things well, leave comments, act like it's for an audience of other programmers, even if that audience is only future you. I'll get off my soapbox, but that's my philosophy on that. This does nothing, but it informs. So the next thing that happens on all the singletons, and this is important, it's not critical, but it's so helpful, is that I put a static singleton instance there. So anywhere I go, and then this instance, by the way, you can search for it, you'll see it. It's nulled out in the cleanup. We'll talk about cleanup in a bit. And then should be in here. Here it is. In do faction general aggregations paused or unpaused. Oh my God, what a mouthful. It assigns the instance every time this is called. We're going to talk about that method in a bit as well. When you have that instance, what this means is any other window, I'm in some random window here. This is the factions window. Why not? So I can just start typing Dark Spire faction BaseInfo dot instance dot do whatever the heck I want. Now, important note, if you are following the conventions correctly, Dark Spire faction BaseInfo dot instance is not always filled. The criteria for if it's filled or not is the Dark faction here. So I can check and see if the Dark Spire exists by saying, hey, if this is not null, do something with them. If that's null, I know they're not here. You know, because any given faction is not in every game, right? So that's an example of a faction using a singleton pattern because it's only allowed to be in there once. If the XML was changed around such that there could be multiple of these, I would need to take this off, stop having an instance, and then if people need to talk about this faction at that point, there are various ways you can go about doing it. And the Macrophage is actually a great example of that because it has two singleton subfactions, tamed and enraged, and then it has any number of big macrophage classes. And so there is a macrophage faction BaseInfo that can be, this is just the normal macrophage, but when you add them, you get an enraged and you get an untamed version. And the tamed and the enraged do very, very little. They inherit from the core. And a lot of times I use the word base, but I don't want to confuse anybody. So instead I say core or root for this. So the root object or the core object of the macrophage class is what is shared between all three kinds, the enraged, the tamed, and the normal. What you're seeing right in here is very little. This is just the stuff that is for the regular macrophage that you encounter. If I go into the BaseInfo core, here's where the real meat is. This is the logic that does most stuff for both the tamed, the enraged, and the regular. And I even have I enforce on myself these bools have to be filled for is it tamed or is it enraged. And you can see that in the enraged and tamed classes, they're setting those. And so when I am in the macrophage BaseInfo core, I can check, hey, am I the enraged version? If so, do this bit of logic. Oh, am I the tamed version? If so, do this bit of logic. Don't do this bit of logic for the enraged one. You know, that's that sort of thing. It makes it really, really easy. What's really worth noting about this new framework is that we want to understand the cost of a given operation. How much CPU time does it cost to call this? Well, that's a getter method. So, and it's abstract, it's not virtual. So it's even it's faster than virtual. I mean, I can look up the general nanosecond timeframes, but I mean, it's one method call essentially, and it returns a Boolean. So no garbage, it's all in the stack. That is fast. Now, in the past, when we had to call, like, get the extended tamed data for the macrophage, that was a method that then looked inside an array, which then tried to see if a thing was in the array, and if it was, then it would pull it out. It would do a cast. If it couldn't do the cast, then it would, like, there was all this stuff that happened, and it was very inefficient. And how frequently is that called all over the code base? You get millions of those sort of calls per second, most likely. If you're running the simulation at 10 frames a second and you're running the long-range threading at, kind of constantly in the background, and then you've got the UI running at, I don't know, hopefully like 60 to 120 frames per second, that's a lot of calls. And a lot of array lookups, a lot of things that are a little more time consuming than just a little basic method call or direct code access. So these little conveniences for a programmer, they are conveniences on the one hand. On the other hand, they are tiny little performance improvements. And so it's kind of like healing a million little paper cuts all over something. It's like, how much performance gain can you really get out of that? I don't know. It's unknowable until you really test it. It's going to vary based on the computer. Older computers will probably benefit more because they were already struggling for whatever reason, and now maybe they have a little more throughput because they don't have to do all that array, access stuff, or their RAM is slower, so they don't have to wait quite as long, Like, you can't talk in concrete terms about how long something takes across different hardware. It just, you can talk in generalities relative to, this way of doing things is relatively like 50% more efficient, but is that important or not? Well, it depends on how powerful the thing is and if it's already running at capacity or not, if that makes sense. So the goal is to, make it not, let's be smart about it. So we're going to come back to the missing faction info and just talk about this at this point, because this doesn't actually do anything. This is just the root of all stuff that must happen, that you must implement on your faction, both base and deep. And then beyond that, you get to choose what to do. So I've showed you how to set up a singleton for the classes that are that and why. Missing faction is not a singleton. It should never show up in code. It comes when we can't find a faction for some reason. Maybe it got deleted out of the XML. Maybe a mod's not installed. Maybe it was just improperly removed instead of deprecated. I don't know. Something happened. And so we couldn't find a faction. And so we're linked to this now. And as noted, it doesn't really do anything. So we've got, these are the ingredients you must have, though. We'll start with BaseInfo and we'll go from there. So you got the class definition, has to inherit from ExternalFaction BaseInfoRoot. Technically a lie. It doesn't actually have to. If you really want to, you can actually inherit from ExternalFaction BaseInfo, which is a class in core, which inherits from external data underscore faction plus all these other things. And that inherits from external database for multiples, which inherits from external data absolute base, which really, that doesn't inherit from anything. Okay, yeah, so there's some depth to this. The chain of inheritance is a little bit on the intimidating side, but I promise this isn't clever code. This is just proper object-oriented design, extrapolated out exactly as far as it needs to be and no further. So I would strongly suggest that you inherit from ExternalFaction BaseInfoRoot, because otherwise there's a bunch of stuff in here that you will need to replicate yourself, and you would almost certainly implement all of these things pretty much the exact same way. And a lot of these things aren't relevant to every class, so there's really no point in doing this. Also, the way that I have it setting up, getting the settings is really efficient. And and I will probably add to this over time. So you'll get the benefits of whatever I do to improve this, if I do, by inheriting from it. So you don't have to. It's not a must, but it's strongly suggested. You must inherit from this other guy, though. So whether that's directly or indirectly, you're inheriting from this thing in core. So now we've established that. Generally, we have a list of okay, you don't have to organize your file a specific way, but it's highly advisable. If you want yourself in the future to be able to find stuff, and if you want anybody else to be able to read your code, it's a really good idea to organize things a certain way. And when you make mistakes in how you organize things, it actually can cause substantial confusion. And I ran into that some over the last 3 weeks of converting stuff. So first, I typically have the serialized fields. Let's look at that in a real faction. Let's pick Astro Trains. So they have some number of serialized fields. Now these ones I can trust because they're marked as being in the serialized section. Hold on, the dog needs to go out. Okay, sorry about that. Dog is out. So because these things are up here in the serialized section, I can trust that these things will be available on a multiplayer client. And I can also trust they will be in the serialization and deserialization methods. So if something is not in the serialization or deserialization method and it's in here, I'm going to assume that's a bug. It's either a bug or it's in the wrong spot. And I ran into finding some things that were in the serialized section of some classes that shouldn't have been. They should have been in the non-serialized section. And I corrected those when I found them, but it was disconcerting because which bug is it? Is it in the wrong place or is it not being serialized? What is the actual problem? And so you don't want to have to wonder when you look at code. Then they have the non-serialized section, and then I typically put any constants below that. There's an idiom around loading custom data, which actually I will show you from Astro Trains in a minute, but it's not something that every faction does. It's not required. Non-serialized data, what is this? Well, this is in base, right? This is in base info, not in deep. So this data is never sent to the client, but it's supposed to exist on the client. They need to be able to build it. So this is a really important distinction. So these fields should not exist in BaseInfo at all if the client or the UI aren't going to be able to look at them. So for instance, in DeepInfo, we often have some long-range, long-term planning, so LRP versions of some lists and things. Those exist in DeepInfo, and they stay in DeepInfo, and Base doesn't ever need to know about it. No UI can look at it. The host could ask for that information as kind of debug info and output it for debugging purposes only on the host, but a client would just see nothing, if that makes sense. All of these things in this not serialized section are actually probably the meat of what the UI is going to see, because these are like information collections and things like that. Like, where are the stations? Where are the train guards? Where are the train depots? So that sort of thing. These things help us fill tooltips. They help us properly, if there's any client-side logic that is part of the simulation, then these are used in that. And then beyond that, they're used in DeepInfo. So here's the thing. DeepInfo does not run on the client. So if you fill these things from DeepInfo, you've introduced a problem. The host and you and your testing in single player will see these things just fine. But the client won't. So as an idiom, as a pattern, these things really should be filled in BaseInfo. They can be altered temporarily on in DeepInfo, and I'll talk about that with the double buffered concurrent lists. That's a threading thing, and that's a data sharing thing, and it's the sort of thing that it's a topic all into itself. But in general, all of this information here is filled in either do refresh from faction settings or from what we call stage 2 logic, the stage 2 aggregating step. And so this code right here is what fills all of this. And then later, DeepInfo uses it, the UI uses it, any other sort of simulation stuff. It's possible to have a stage 3 simulation. We do here on the BaseInfo. One of the things that can cause a minor desync, which is not a problem per se, but it's going to increase bandwidth and be a little weird, is when you try, and there's a lot of times where we're attritioning certain units because they've drifted out of usefulness or something. Like there's a guard that doesn't have a train to guard anymore. Well, they just kind of slowly die over time. And so there's some logic for that, and that was originally in DeepInfo. And that's acceptable. It's not going to hurt anything. This game is Wolverine, and it will notice the desync eventually, and it will correct it. But meanwhile, things are going to be wrong on the client, and the syncing process to get the data corrected is going to eat up some bandwidth, especially if it's happening really frequently. So we are saving bandwidth by running this attrition process on the stage 3 main client and host in BaseInfo. And that's useful. I mean, this game can be bandwidth hungry. And the thing that makes it bandwidth hungriest is when it has to be Wolverine a lot. The more it has to self-heal, the more bandwidth it uses. And so you can improve the general networking experience for everybody by making sure your mod is as respectful of sync as possible. And the base game is not fully there yet. There are things that I could do to improve it, but I didn't want to try and tackle that while I was tackling the great refactor as a whole. Things like this sort of attritioning I did move over. There are others I have flagged to move over later. It's not a crisis in the meantime. If multiplayer is not playable right now, it's not. It needs some work. But once multiplayer is playable, this would not make it unplayable. But we're talking about a steady small drain of CPU and bandwidth to communicate about these stupid attritioning guards rather than just letting everybody know and do it themselves. So I'm trying to segment out where the data is, where it came from, and how it affects the flow of a game by where we're putting it. All right, so the next thing is we had a huge memory leak. And I fixed that before we got into all this, but then that introduced a bunch of bugs. And the memory leak, I think Donnie Expert maybe was the one. I really hope I'm not giving wrong credit, but was the one who alerted me to it. And it was like they had like 10 gigs of usage for AI War 2 after like an hour of playing. And that is unexpected and not acceptable. And it was because of a bunch of external data being leaked. I'm almost positive, but I can't prove it, that the multiplayer clients were suffering from performance degradation due to ongoing memory leaks as well. It seems to be something that fits the pattern of things people were complaining about. It bugs me that I can't prove that it was happening, but that was because of the architecture didn't let me prove it. If it happens in the future, I'll be able to prove it. So that's, again, part of what this architecture is about. That brings us to the topic of pooling, though. All of the external data is pooled, which means that the first Devourer Golem faction that you have, that object gets reused for the next Devourer Golem unless you need 2 at once. If you need 2 at once, it'll make a second one, and now you've got 2 at once. If you have 3 at once, it'll make a third, and you have 3 at once. Fine. But as long as you only have 1 at a time, if you play games serially and don't quit back out to the desktop, you just go to the main menu and then start a new game. The Devourer Golem faction object is the same each time. It gets put into cold storage, back into the pool, and it gets pulled back out. In order for that to work properly, you must clean up after yourself. So cleanup often is analogous to initialization. Now, it's kind of an idiom that Badger started, and I think it's a good one. Let's look at Dark Spire. Why not? We'll look at a variety of classes here. So in Dark Spire here, we've got our serialized, we've got our not serialized, there's no constants. Okay, fine. We've got our constructor. It calls cleanup. You don't have to. Strongly suggest it though. That way, whatever's going on is the same on every subsequent run. So it happens the first run, and it happens every run after that too. And so you know that it's going to be -1 every time. I don't have to set that it's -1 up here or worry about, well, it's -1 up here, but after it's cleared once, then it defaults to 0. Oops. Now it's different slightly the second time we run this. You don't want that. You don't want any part of that. If you call cleanup, any default settings that are up here are going to get wiped out. So you can ignore anything that's going on up there. We don't care. These things, these mean nothing because they're getting overwritten here in cleanup. This is what means something. This gets called right before a faction comes out of a pool for the first time and every time after that, and it touches every field in the entire class. If you don't know if you've gotten every field or not, you can just go in like this and you can look, and there's all the fields. Now, some of those are sub ones, and so you don't have to worry about those because if it's not part of your actual direct class, you don't have to worry about it. You can't copy paste from here, but if you go into the class view, then, well, if you go, it's annoying. If you go external, and this is Dark Spire. Dark Spire. We'll just go from there. It's searching external Dark Spire. Yep. Right. So when you click this, you see the actual. So this is the class view. You click this, it's got the base types and some other things down here. In this window, you can see the methods, and then you get all the properties and variables. You can actually select that, hit Control-C, Control-V, and paste that in. It doesn't do well in there. So if you go to, I usually like to use Notepad++. Okay, this is still problematic, right? It didn't give us any white space properly. So you just go in like this and replace the Dark Spire Faction BaseInfo, and I've got the extended replacements in there, and boom, you've got it. Now you've got this, which you can paste in here, and then clean all those up. As part of the cleanup method, just clean each of these things. Now you'll notice I'm not cleaning all of these. The reason for that is that some of these are the XML data, and that gets overwritten by load custom data if needed. There's a have data loaded. This triggers an XML reload, so I don't have to worry about those variables. The only ones I actually have to worry about are the ones I can see up here. They're nicely organized, so I match the organization up there and down here and make things really easy on myself. I can see that conquest mode is right above teams. Darn it, I messed up apparently, and there's a per planet thing. That should be higher. You know, that should be above last locust attempt time. This is nicer code because now I can tell at a glance that things are, you know, correct. So the cleanup is really, really important. It matters a lot on clients to some extent, and second time you run something. So a thing to know about map generation, when you're in the lobby, every time you change a faction, change what planet you're looking at, etc., it's regenerating it again. So it's putting these back in and pulling them back out. When you hit start, then it generates it again. And it's reusing those same objects in the pool over and over and over again. And so if you're not cleaning up properly after yourself, then potentially the first time that you run it, straight out of coming out of the lobby, you're going to have wrong data. But you're definitely going to have really weird data if you come back, you hit quit back to main menu, and then you go into the lobby again, you start again. Suddenly you've got stale data in there. You don't want any part of that. So cleanup is important. Serialization and deserialization. I really prefer having it in this order, where you serialize stuff in, you deserialize stuff out. I like putting regions around code so that it collapses nicely and I can see things, but for people not using an IDE, it's really meaningless. This get difficulty ordinal or -1 if not relevant. This is basically, do you have a difficulty? Do you have an intensity, a strength, something? It's usually a 0 to 10 scale in this game. If so, tell us what it is, because we're reacting to, in various places, just how tough are you, dude? You know, are you the really killer 10 version? Are you a really weak 1 version? There's code that, like for spawning random factions, for instance, or random other things that will look at that if you provide it. Or if you say -1, then it's like, I don't do gradations. I just work here, you know. This, do faction general aggregations paused run paused. Yeah, my names are long. They're meant to be really descriptive. This happens a lot. This happens early as well. This happens before any faction logic is run anywhere. It happens before any UI could look at it, before any map generation could look at it. It's as early as it gets. This is not a constructor, but it's kind of like one. And it also, however, gets called repeatedly. And that's important because players can change settings, which could be relevant in here. So what do you do in here? I mean, you must implement it. I made it, it's that important. I made it so you must implement it, but you don't have to actually do anything there. You can choose to have it blank if you don't have anything to do. Well, looking at Astro Trains, one of the things that's really nice to do is you can assign your singleton in there. That way you can truly check if your singleton, like you can check and say, hey, all right, are the Astro Trains in here or not? By the time where you have some code that could check Astro Trains faction BaseInfo.instance not equal to null, this has been run. So you know that that'll return true if, if the Astro Trains are present, and it'll return false if they're not present. That's handy. The other thing that's really useful to do is if you're loading any custom data from XML, go ahead and do that now. These things are run serially just in case you need to, but it only runs it once per setup. You could make it so that once it's loaded once, it never loads again. That'd be fine. This was a bug, by the way. There was not a multi-train spawn by intensity.clear before this. And so then I was running into this error yesterday because it had probably a number of spawn intensities of 20 or 30, something like that, because I was on my subsequent run. And so, you know, you'll find errors like that pretty easily if you put in self-check code. So that's kind of all that's done in there. But there's a sibling class called do refresh from faction settings. Now, this one happens early, very early, same exact earliness as this one. And it happens if the game is paused or unpaused, but it does not happen as frequently. And it actually happens on a randomized interval. What the heck? Let's go into the root class and see what I did. In here, I have a private and self-private, so it's not stuff that shows out into the, you're not accidentally seeing it in the inherited classes, so it's not protected. Protected means the children in inheriting classes can see it. Private means they can't. Public means everybody sees it. So in here, I've actually got a do general aggregations pause run pause that calls the do factions one, and what it does right before that is refresh the settings, and so the settings happens before the aggregation thing. This is our timekeeper, and this is our generalized random that is not simulation safe, and so this will wait between 400 milliseconds and 1.9 seconds. Why is it randomized? The reason is that there is an unknown amount of load coming from this, and if every faction were, let's say every faction, every half second, all the factions pulled their settings data, that could cause uneven frame times where every half second you get an extra long frame, and it affects the smoothness of how the camera moves and a whole bunch of other things like that. You wouldn't think that sort of thing could add up, but it can. Is this probably over paranoid? Yes, definitely. However, it's really useful to be able to have information on a quick human time scale, but not like instantly all the time. So this do refresh from settings is something that we can do, and anything that is literally from the settings of the faction, like, hey, is this am I a vassal? And did that change in the last 400 milliseconds to 1.9 seconds? Well, it loads that. It says a false here to say that it does not complain about it if it doesn't find the vassal faction or the vassal data. So it won't complain on this particular field if it doesn't find that. So if you misspell this in the XML, it's just gonna not work with vassals, and it's never going to complain at you. And that's unfortunate, actually. It's usually better if it does complain, if it's expecting it. But this is a generalized base class, and so it doesn't know if you're going to have vassal capability or not on that class. So it can't do that enforcement for you, unfortunately. So I'm not going to save any of my changes from there. So instead, I go ahead and load the config off of that. Then I set the intensity, which you'll notice the intensity is what's returned here. If we need to load some custom data, then we load that. If we need to calculate some stuff, we do that, because these things are calculated based on the intensity. That's why we're doing them here. And so the intensity might have just changed. Probably not, but it might have. And so we do these things here. Lastly, that's it, actually. No lastly. So for BaseInfo, those are all the things you're required to do. It's strongly advised that you also, if you need to write text to the second line of the left sidebar in the lobby, like where it says strength or nom or all whatever it is, then this is where you would write that. And this is happening after the singletons and all the other things have been established. The data is nice and fully populated by now. This is just a custom method. Append state for debug info. That's a method you can override and then use it in some windows if you want to like see what the state of your factions are internally. It's optional. You can override the set starting faction relationships. Normally, set starting faction relationships does the same base original logic that the external faction class, I don't remember what it was called, used to do. And actually that's implemented elsewhere. At any rate, it just calls into there's an allegiance helper, and it calls into that in a like set up default allegiances, and you can call the base of that if you want to, or you can ignore the base and then just do your own thing. If you ignore the base, then you're friend nor enemy to anybody. And so you're going to need to start establishing who you're friends and enemies against. And so this one says, you know, make myself an ally to everybody except the players. So this is Astro Trains. And there's even a helpful note here. Why? These are friendly with everyone since only the players should interact with them. In other words, we want them to be ignored. Astro Trains exist. Other factions exist. We don't want the Dark Zenith coming in and like raiding Astro Trains. That's not what the Astro Trains are for. They're not supposed to just like be a force for chaos in that way. They're for the players to deal with or not deal with. Everybody else ignores them. So we're friends to everybody but the player. Hooray. You'll notice I'm passing in this.AttachedFaction. That's something that tells you, lets you get to the faction that you're talking about. And you can do this at AttachedFaction.do for entities, all that sort of thing. This is the actual faction class. So when we go to, it's a faction of that sort. And, you know, the faction itself has all these things which you're probably familiar with if you've been modding. So this Astro Trains actually has a teaching moment showing how to handle the subdata. And this is where we get into double buffered lists. I'm going to talk about that in another video. First of all, we're going to talk about the DeepInfo real quick for the MissingFaction. So the MissingFaction DeepInfo, this also very, very simple. However, there's a thing that I like to do here. First, there's a couple things we have to do, and then there's some stuff I like to do. First, we must give it some sort of name like this. It can be anything you want. Bob's Faction, doesn't matter. What you do need to know, if you name this Astro Trains, you can name every faction you ever have Astro Trains in here. You can just copy paste if you wanted to, no problem. The long range planning, those happen on separate threads back in the background, right? So let's say we've got 10 factions. We've got like, I don't know, humans, AIs, wardens, hunters, praetorian, Astro Trains. We've got, let's say we've got 2 devourers. We've got 1 Dark Spire and 1 Dark Zenith, 2 Zenith Svikari, however you say that word. All of those normally would happen in parallel all at the same time, except there's a problem with that. Certain ones can't run at the same time because they share methods or working data. Now, you can get around that being a problem by not using static variables and by using double buffered lists if you are using static variables, or use thread static stuff. There's several different strategies you can use to get around it. It's also just sometimes nicer not to run them all at once. It doesn't really matter, but what I have done is made it so that anything that has the same unique name won't run at the same time. So I described having 2 Devourer factions. It would run one, and when it's done, it'll run the next one. And then when that one's done, it'll run the first one again, and so on and so forth for planning. For the Dark Zenith, I described having 1 Dark Zenith faction. It happens to be Singleton. And I described having 2 Svikari. That's theoretically a problem because the Svikari use some of the same data structures as the Dark Spire. So we could have some cross-threading contention there. And so this is the Dark Spire. This is the Dark Spire, not Dark Zenith. Excuse me. So there's a shared root, just like the shared core one on there. And I have Dark Zenith of all kinds as the name. So if it's regular or Svikari, we don't care. Take turns. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3 for that Dark Zenith Svikari 1, Svikari 2. And so this is very useful for cutting down on thread contention. Now, if we ran every faction with just faction is the name, then they would just go humans, now AI, now hunter, now warden, now blah, blah, blah. You lose all that parallelism. One, you're using the CPU cores less efficiently. Two, it's going to take a lot more time for the long range planning to actually run. So factions will seem stupider the more factions you have. So there's a middle ground in the middle that you should stick to. Do any initialization immediately after faction assigned. There's pretty much only one thing to do, and that is get the other data. You'll notice this doesn't exist. This method exists on BaseInfo and DeepInfo, but BaseInfo doesn't bother to override it because there's nothing to do. I mean, I don't have anything to do. You might, but the way that I've got it set up, there's nothing to do. BaseInfo cannot possibly reference DeepInfo because the DLL base can't see deep. That's the encapsulation. It can't see into deep. Deep can see everything in basic, which is also important because it needs to be able to operate on everything there. But it also needs to be a little careful about what it touches, as I noted in 2 videos back, or 1 video back. I don't know now. So it's really, really common that we're going to need to do this.baseinfo.something. And so I just wind up having a BaseInfo variable that gets assigned. You say get external BaseInfo as, and you put the name of the BaseInfo faction, or in a few other cases, you do it a little bit differently, actually. For the Zenith, for instance, I don't get the Dark Zenith Svikari or the Dark Zenith main faction DeepInfo. I don't get either of these. They do assign in their stuff themselves. They have their own call here, so it can set up its own instance. That's another great place to set up instance in the DeepInfo for singleton types. But I'm pulling not this type, not the equivalent of this type. I'm pulling the BaseInfoRoot instead, because that's what matters. That's where all the data is. And these ones that inherit from it just kind of give extra data to it. So now that we have a BaseInfo, we can just say this.BaseInfo dot, and what do we want? We want to know about the allegiance. We want to know about the attached faction. Well, we've got that here too. We don't need to do that from there, but we can call like, hey, get the raid desirability. Where's some action? Oh, there's missing faction. That's why. If I was on the Astro Train thing, it's like get this.BaseInfo.training depots, you know, that sort of thing. Remember how I was talking earlier about you want to know what the cost is in CPU time of what you're doing? This is how you cut that down. You cache this. So this get external BaseInfo as, that has a cost to it. It's not extreme. It's fairly straightforward code. It's actually a lot less costly than what we used to do. And so for squads, you're going to be calling that sort of thing a lot. Get, create, or try get. For factions, let's try not to call that at all if we can. Instead, you just set up the BaseInfo and you assign it here, and you just call this.BaseInfo.whatever. And at this point, that's a variable access and then a method call, or another variable access or a property or access or whatever it is. That is fast. Like, that is way faster than calling a method, which calls into an array of things, which then does a cast, which then does a, you know, like, we're not doing any of that stuff. So this is way, way faster. Paper cuts, you know what I mean? We're cleaning up paper cuts. There's a cleanup here, same as on the other. Same general rules apply. I do not have a convention of having serialized, non-serialized, and constants in here because there's generally not that kind of data in here. We're not usually serializing anything from in here. If there was, I would definitely mark it as serialized, because that'd be kind of a surprising thing. There is 0 serialized data of any of our deep info classes at the moment. Then there's this here, minimum seconds between long range planning. So that's when we're doing deep thoughts about whatever it is we're doing. How often do we want to do deep thoughts? So for somebody who has very few CPU cores, let's say they have 2 or God forbid 1, do the zombies really need to recalculate what their orders might be every half second, every 100 milliseconds or something? Probably not. I mean, so instead, pick some sort of interval that makes sense. For the missing faction, 20 seconds, because they're not doing anything very rapidly. For most of the factions, it's 10 seconds or less, or 5 seconds or less. You expect most factions to react within a couple of seconds. There are a few that run way less frequently, and those are mostly player allied or just do some really kind of basic checks and things. Most of the ones that actually think and are enemies, that sort of thing, run every 2 or 3 seconds. You need to remember, though, that if you've got multiples of that faction, so let's say you've got, pick one that we actually can have multiples of. I'm pretty sure Scourge, that's not a singleton, is it? Nope. So you could have 3 different enemy Scourge and 2 allied Scourge. You'd have 5 Scourge factions at that point. There's a 2-second delay between which it'll run. So how often do they run? Does it take 2 times 5, so 10 seconds to run all of them? Thankfully not. Each individual faction will only run with a maximum frequency of every 2 seconds. So if you have a single Scourge, it'll run no more frequently than 2 seconds. If you have 5 of them, and let's say that each one takes half a second to run, then you will blow through all of those in the half a second times 5, so 2.5 seconds to run through all of them. And then right around the time that all of them have run, then the first one that ran will go, hey, it's been longer than 2 seconds because it's been 2.5 seconds, and so it'll run. So in that sort of scenario, you will always have a Scourge faction long range planning because it takes, because of that math that I just outlined. That is worth knowing. And that's the generalities. You can get back and forth between, well, not back and forth. You can get from deep to base that way, and base fills info, which then goes to deep. I'm going to break here for this video, and in the next video I'm going to talk about the double buffered collections.